The brazen bull. This might be the most psychologically twisted punishment ever invented. Created in ancient Greece around 560 BC by a bronze worker named Perseus of Athens, this was a hollow bronze statue of a bull, approximately life-sized. The condemned would be locked inside through a door in the side, and then a fire would be lit underneath. As the bronze heated up, you'd be slowly roasted alive inside. The metal would get hot enough to literally cook human flesh. We're talking temperatures of 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. You couldn't sit still, you couldn't lean against the walls because everything was burning hot. Victims would involuntarily perform a dance of death, trying to avoid touching the superheated metal. But here's the truly diabolical part. Perseus designed a system of tubes and acoustic chambers inside the bull's head that would convert the victim's screams into sounds that resembled the bellowing of an actual bull. He literally engineered a device to turn human agony into entertainment. So from the outside, it would look and sound like this bronze bull was simply bellowing and snorting, while inside, someone was being literally cooked alive in the dark, their screams transformed into animal sounds. Perseus presented this invention to Phalaris, the tyrant of Sicily, probably hoping for a reward. Phalaris was reportedly so impressed that he wanted to test it immediately. On who? On Perseus himself, the inventor. Phalaris had him locked in his own creation, heated it up briefly so Phalaris could hear the bull sounds himself, then pulled him out and threw him off a cliff. Talk about instant karma. Build a torture device, become its first victim. The bull itself supposedly continued to be used for years. Some accounts say Phalaris himself eventually died in it when he was overthrown. The device became so notorious that multiple Greek cities later claimed to have the original brazen bull. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. England's signature punishment for high treason was so elaborate, so systematically cruel, that it had multiple separate stages, and they're all in the name. First, you'd be dragged, drawn, through the streets behind a horse, tied to a wooden hurdle. Not to kill you, just to humiliate you and get you to the execution site, maybe breaking a few bones along the way. Second, you'd be hanged by the neck from a gallows, but not until death. They'd cut you down while you were still conscious, still struggling to breathe, your neck damaged, but not broken. Third, and this is where it gets truly horrific, you'd be disemboweled while still alive. They'd cut open your abdomen and remove your intestines while you watched. Then they'd castrate you and burn your genitals and internal organs in front of you, in a brazier set up specifically for that purpose. Finally, after all that, they'd behead you and cut your body into 4 parts, the quartering. Your head and body parts would be displayed in different locations across the kingdom as a warning. London Bridge famously displayed the heads of executed traitors on spikes. This was the official punishment for high treason in England from the 13th century until 1870. That's right, 1870. People were still being sentenced to this during the Victorian era, though by then it was usually commuted to simple hanging. The most famous victim? Guy Fawkes, of the gunpowder plot. Though he actually managed to jump from the gallows and break his neck, dying before the worst parts. Even in death, he caught a lucky break. The last people sentenced to this were members of the Cato Street conspiracy in 1820, though they were hanged until dead first, then beheaded afterward. A merciful modification. Breaking wheel. Medieval Europe wasn't playing around either. Let me introduce you to the breaking wheel. Picture a large wooden wheel, like a wagon wheel. The condemned would be tied to it, spread-eagled, and then the executioner would use an iron hammer or bar to methodically break every major bone in their body. Arms, legs, ribs, shoulders, everything. But they wouldn't kill you. After breaking your bones, they'd weave your shattered limbs through the spokes of the wheel and hoist it up on a pole for public display. You'd be left there, broken and twisted, still alive, until you eventually died from exposure, dehydration, shock, or infection. This could take days. In France, they called it roux. In Germany, rad. It was used across Europe from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, typically for serious crimes like murder, highway robbery, or treason. The worst recorded case? A man in Germany in 1348 reportedly survived for 9 days on the wheel. 9 days with every major bone in his body broken, bent backwards through a wheel, displayed in the town square as a warning to others. Sometimes, if they wanted to show mercy, or if the victim's family paid, the executioner would strike a fatal blow to the chest or neck after breaking the limbs. That was called retentum, a merciful death. The fact that that was considered mercy tells you everything. The last known execution by breaking wheel was in Prussia in 1841. That's not ancient history, that's less than 200 years ago. Next up, China's method of lingqi, which translates to slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. This was used in China from roughly 900 AD until it was finally banned in 1905. Yeah, 1905. That's not even 120 years ago. Your great-great-grandparents could have been alive when this was still legal. The executioner would use a sharp knife to methodically remove pieces of the condemned person's body, small slices of flesh, one at a time. They'd start with less vital areas like the chest and thighs, working their way inward over hours or even days. There were actual manuals for executioners on the order of cuts. The goal was to maximize pain while keeping the person conscious and alive as long as possible. Expert executioners took pride in their ability to keep someone alive through dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cuts. Photography was invented just in time to capture some of the last cases of lingqi, and those images are disturbing, to say the least. I'm obviously not showing them, but they exist in historical archives. This punishment was reserved for the worst crimes: treason, killing one's parents, or mass murder. The number of cuts could be specified in the sentence, anywhere from 8 cuts to 3,600 cuts for the most severe cases. But here's the thing: sometimes the condemned person's family could bribe the executioner to make the first cut fatal. That was considered an act of mercy. Imagine having to pay extra for a quicker death. If you couldn't afford the bribe, you'd experience every single cut as intended. Scaphism. Now we're getting into the truly ancient horrors. Meet scaphism, from ancient Persia, also known as the boats. Here's how it worked. They'd trap you between 2 small boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with only your head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then they'd force-feed you milk and honey until you got severe diarrhea. They'd also cover you in more honey to attract insects. Then they'd leave you floating in a stagnant pond, in the hot sun. The honey attracted flies, wasps, and other insects that would feed on your exposed flesh. The diarrhea meant you're literally sitting in your own waste, which attracted even more insects. They'd keep force-feeding you to keep you alive as long as possible. According to historical accounts, this could take weeks. The Greek historian Plutarch described a Persian soldier who survived 17 days of this torture. 17 days. Gradually being eaten alive by insects while covered in your own filth. And here's what makes it even worse. As the days went on, maggots would begin breeding in your waste and rotting flesh. You'd literally become a living hive for insects while still conscious. The worst part? This wasn't reserved for the worst criminals. Persian kings would use this for political enemies. Disagree with the wrong person? Welcome to the boats. Modern historians debate whether scaphism was actually practiced or if it was Greek propaganda to make the Persians look barbaric. But multiple ancient sources mention it, and the method is horrifyingly plausible. Cement shoes. Let's jump forward in time to the 20th century organized crime in America. Cement shoes, also called concrete boots, were allegedly a mob execution method. The process was grimly simple. They'd put your feet in a bucket or box, pour in wet concrete, wait for it to dry, then throw you into a river, lake, or ocean. The weight of the concrete would drag you straight to the bottom, and you'd drown, unable to swim, unable to escape, sinking like a stone. Now here's the interesting part. While cement shoes became iconic in mob movies and pop culture, there's very little actual evidence that the mafia regularly used this method. Most mob hits were shootings, quick, efficient, and less elaborate. But it did happen. In 2016, a body was found in Brooklyn's Gowanus Canal wearing concrete-filled sneakers. And there are a handful of other documented cases throughout the 20th century. What makes this punishment particularly cruel is the anticipation. Unlike a bullet to the head, you'd have time while the concrete was drying to think about what was coming. You'd feel yourself being loaded onto a boat. You'd see the water approaching. And then those final moments of sinking, lungs burning, knowing there's absolutely no way out. The mafia might not have used cement shoes as often as movies suggest, but they used them enough that the fear was real. And sometimes, the threat of a punishment is just as effective as the punishment itself. Bamboo torture. This one sounds almost absurd until you understand the science behind it. Bamboo torture allegedly originated in Asia and gained notoriety during World War II. Here's how it supposedly worked. They'd tie you down over a patch of young bamboo shoots. Then, they'd wait. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants on Earth. Some species can grow up to 35 inches in a single day. That's almost 1.5 inches per hour. And bamboo shoots are incredibly sharp and strong when they're growing. So, as you're tied down, unable to move, the bamboo would slowly grow up through your body. Over the course of several days, these shoots would pierce through your back, through your organs, eventually coming out the other side. Now, here's the thing. There's almost no historical documentation of this actually being used. Most references come from World War II propaganda and post-war accounts that are difficult to verify. The Mythbusters team even tested it and confirmed that bamboo could grow through a ballistic gel torso in 3 days. So it's physically possible, but was it actually used? We don't know for sure. What makes this one so disturbing isn't just the pain, it's the helplessness. You're not being actively tortured by a person. You're being killed by a plant, slowly, inevitably, with nothing you can do about it. That's a special kind of psychological horror. Blood Eagle. Let's head to Viking Age Scandinavia for something that sounds like it came straight out of a horror movie. The Blood Eagle. According to Norse sagas, this ritual execution involved cutting the ribs away from the spine with an axe, then pulling the lungs out through the opening to create the appearance of wings. The victim would be kept alive during the entire process. Now here's where it gets controversial. Many modern historians think the Blood Eagle might be mythological, a way to make Viking warriors sound more terrifying than they actually were. The descriptions come from sagas written centuries after the Viking Age, but whether it actually happened or not, multiple Norse texts describe it. The most famous alleged victim was King Ella of Northumbria, who supposedly received this punishment from the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok as revenge for their father's death. You might recognize those names if you've watched Vikings. Medical experts who've analyzed the descriptions say that if performed as described, the victim would die almost immediately from shock and blood loss. So either the sagas exaggerated how long victims survived, or it was pure mythology to begin with. Still, the fact that Vikings wanted their enemies to believe they did this? That's psychological warfare at its finest. The Iron Maiden. We're kicking things off with one of the most iconic torture devices in history, the Iron Maiden. Picture a human-sized cabinet made of iron or wood, with a front that opens like a door. The inside? Lined with metal spikes positioned at strategic points, long enough to pierce the body, but carefully placed to avoid hitting vital organs immediately. The victim would be forced inside, and when the door closed, the spikes would penetrate their body from all sides. But here's the twisted genius. The spikes weren't long enough to kill you quickly. They'd pierce your eyes, your chest, your limbs, causing excruciating pain but keeping you alive, sometimes for hours, bleeding out slowly in complete darkness. Now, historians debate whether the Iron Maiden was actually used as much as legends suggest, or if it was more of a scary story. Some think many of the ones we see in museums were actually created in the 18th and 19th centuries to attract tourists to their torture chambers. But real or exaggerated, the fact that people designed and built these things tells you something about human imagination. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was supposedly used for over 200 years, and one account claims a victim survived inside for 3 days before dying. True or not, the psychological horror of being locked in a spiked coffin, unable to move without impaling yourself further, is nightmare fuel. Crucifixion. We're starting with one of the most famous execution methods in history, crucifixion. And yes, it's even worse than you think. The Romans perfected this punishment, using it for over 500 years, primarily on slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals. It wasn't just about killing someone, it was about making an example that would last. Here's how it actually worked. First, you'd be whipped or beaten, often so severely that you'd be in shock before you even reached the cross. Then you'd be forced to carry the crossbeam, weighing 75 to 125 pounds, to the execution site. If you collapsed, they'd make someone else carry it, but you'd still have to walk. At the site, you'd be nailed or tied to the cross. The nails? They went through your wrists, not your palms. Palms would just tear. Your feet would be nailed to the vertical beam, often with a single nail through both feet. Then you'd be hoisted up and left to die. But here's the truly horrible part. You wouldn't die from blood loss or the nails. You'd die from asphyxiation over the course of hours or even days. When you're hanging by your arms, you can't breathe properly. To get air, you'd have to push up on the nails through your feet, which would cause excruciating pain. Eventually, your legs would give out from exhaustion, and you'd slump down, unable to breathe. Then survival instinct would kick in, and you'd push up again. This cycle would repeat until you literally couldn't do it anymore. The Romans sometimes broke the victim's legs to speed up death, a mercy that would make asphyxiation happen in minutes instead of hours. That's what happened to the 2 thieves crucified alongside Jesus. According to biblical accounts, crucifixion was so brutal that it was outlawed in the Roman Empire in 337 AD by Constantine. But the punishment was so effective at terrorizing populations that the Romans used it for centuries, reportedly crucifying 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way after the Spartacus Rebellion. A 120-mile stretch of crosses as a warning.